2. Lunchtime. The old man's shirt cuffs were on the verge of fraying, their white cotton edges fuzzy as if sprinkled with a light covering of chalk dust, indicating that far from letting himself go in the collar and cuff department, Charles Marks, physics teacher and oldest member of staff, was seriously contemplating retirement and was yet to decide whether his shirts would make it to the end of the school year or whether he should purchase a new set. He likened retirement to a dusty window that he would clean when the time was right, to give himself a clearer view of what might be in store. He'd spent his working life wiping chalk dust from blackboards, returning them too black or near enough only to start all over. So the window analogy gave him a deep sense of pleasure, as it offered a fresh start and something he could genuinely look forward to. Charming! I'll give you filthy windows, added his wife Mary the night he'd broached the subject at home. Trust you to come up with something like that, Charlie. Most people would simply say they'll think about it nearer the time, but not you. The subject had first cropped up 4 years ago, in 1969, when the school had turned to comprehensive. Previous to that, it had been a that'll-do secondary modern with a population of 600. Since then, the population had increased nearly threefold and construction was lagging behind, as demonstrated by the temporarily installed ranks of olive green terrapin huts. At least, the new science block was up and running. His current bugbear was the raising of the school leaving age. Not the idea, but the timing, as it no doubt meant he'd be teaching children who didn't want to be there, especially those with older siblings who'd left at 14, and he wasn't sure he had the stamina for that. And to cap it all, there was a new science syllabus due to be implemented the following year, designed to unify the three traditional disciplines, the school's council integrated science project with its rather cumbersome acronym SCISP. Employers will be writing in, during a little chat with the head Jones in his office, wanting to know why we're turning out school leavers with lisps. Your college in the art department think it's an exotic venereal disease. Ha! That does not surprise me. Branston, indeed. Anyway, it's not like you to be cynical, Charles. It doesn't suit you. No, I'm full of admiration. Quite an achievement, and not before its time. The brainchild of a spin bowler, I'd wager. Well, a team effort. Shame we weren't in on the trial phases, but the new science block was still under construction then. Oh, yes, of course. He flicked back and forth through the accompanying teacher's handbook entitled Patterns. Its cover, a very modern design featuring red tetrahedra on an olive background, the pages already heavily annotated and bookmarked. Pattern finding seems a tad vague, but as it states, the seedling will require careful nurture, so I'm sure we'll get there. Funny that they feel the need to ingratiate themselves with us oldies, even those like your good self who took time out for active service. I'm inclined to agree with the report from the John Keaton School that it'll be the younger staff who'll struggle to adapt and branch out from their specialist fields. And with the bell ringing for lunchtime, he gathered the book up under his arm and continued to blather on as he edged his way towards the door, giving prominence to critical thinking, leaps in the dark even, and the acquiring of skills over facts. Interesting, damn it. I was born too early. Something like this would have made all the difference in my day. Jones flashed him one of his renowned parting shots. Watch you don't get caught in the slips. No matter how chummy he might get, Jones never failed to assert his authority. He hadn't been awarded the DCM for nothing. Warranted, the word limped out, a casualty of Jones' unmasking, ushering him away from under Jones' stark scrutiny and out into the bleak corridor. His wish that he could have been granted the same opportunities afforded the current generation was sincere. He had always found learning, that is, the acquisition of facts, easy, never thinking of it as study, as that implied effort, and the same applied to exams, which he'd always excelled at. But all that had been trifling, for he'd had his sights set on a bigger prize, to join the ranks of the scientific elite. And he'd fully expected that all the facts he'd amassed would rearrange themselves of their own accord and coalesce into a grand new theory of everything. But it never happened. It seemed he just didn't have it in him. It was a crushing blow for which he was ill prepared. The persistence that genius sprang out of nowhere, that it couldn't be taught, appeared to be true. As he'd considered his options, the one thing he knew he wouldn't be doing was locking himself away in a garret to sink into an opium-induced oblivion, waiting for the universe to reveal its secrets like those artist types. Yes, he knew all about that, albeit at arm's length reading De Quincey via George Eliot, but it was enough to steer him, well, nowhere in particular, but at least away from all that. What he hadn't bargained for was the effect of falling in love with Mary, whom he later married. The effect was so devastating that he thought he was ill. All he could think of was her. He ceased to be able to think straight and seriously worried that he was suffering from some species of entropic brain malfunction, and that all his beloved facts had buggered off somewhere never to return. Then his light bulb moment came during a game of Pass the Parcel of all things at one of Mary's social gatherings. As the parcel went round, he started to notice how each participant tackled the unwrapping. Some like rabid dogs, others methodically peeling back strips of paper, and Mary carefully arranging said strips upon the floor in front of her. As it happened, a career in education had been top of his list, and this sealed it. He could provide the content, leaving his pupils at liberty to confer value as they made sense of their findings. A somewhat lofty way of putting it, but nevertheless the principle was the same, and he stuck with it. As a teacher, he would serve the nation, imparting his knowledge to enable a new generation of scientists, and into this scenario he projected that his efforts would become highly valued and respected. He fully believed that facts would enter children's virginal minds just as easily as they had his. So, ditching the parcel analogy for one that met with his passion for gardening, he viewed the classroom as a fertile seedbed where young buds, fed by his meticulously honed notes over the decades, might flower and prosper. However, the equation underpinned by this dubious sentiment quickly unraveled. Children are not flowers. And whilst the SCISP handbook referenced the need to nurture seedlings, there was no point in him pretending it was alluding to anything beyond a fine-tuning of the syllabus. If anything, it just went to underline how out of step he was with current trends. As much as he was optimistic for the pupils, he didn't hold out much hope for the latest influx of teachers who were meant to be guiding them. Many, especially in the arts, had an air of just passing through about them as if they were more committed to their hippie lifestyles than anything resembling a career. His carefully maintained borders were being ransacked by flower people. A ridiculously ironic twist that he didn't find remotely amusing, and to top it all, the personal reverence he had always enjoyed as an avuncular sort of chap had been whipped away from under his feet when, thanks to the bothersome Branston, he'd acquired the name Groucho. It was said that the adoption of his comic counterpart's name was far more suited to his character than that of his German namesake, and it spread like wildfire. With a sad heart, Charles Marx retreated into himself where in his darker moments he still harboured a stinging sense of injustice, that the genius at birth argument sold to him when he was young had deprived him of any chance of becoming the Nobel Prize-winning pioneer of his childhood dreams. None of this played any part in the sherbet fizz of Gary and his mates Dylan and Spud. To them, Groucho was no more real than a character in a comic. He was their creation, and of his true nature they had no interest. This was because Groucho only taught older brainy kids, so their day-to-day experience of him was confined to lunchtimes when he patrolled the garden border to keep the law and order. For his part, Charles Marx simply did this to help pass the time while he was away from his gardening or fishing. Lost in reverie, he'd imagine the incessant babbling stream of children with their dashing, yelling faces to be a salmon run in full flow, with him standing there fishing rod in hand. At quieter moments, he even viewed stragglers and dawdlers as trout idly drifting by, aimless and carefree. He was certainly no wounded beast turned tyrant. Someone like PE teacher Ellis Watts might think that doling out wet balling with sadistic regularity was character building, but not Groucho. He'd witnessed enough violence in his lifetime to be of the opinion that it wasn't his job to perpetuate it, and he ranked encouragement over punishment as the most effective means of nurturing growth. This was plain enough to see in how he conducted his classes, but his presence when roaming the corridors was something else. Since most of the time he just stood there, lost in a trance. Any skirmishes he did make bore no relation to any real misconduct, were completely arbitrary, but were nevertheless effective. The fear he unwittingly instilled in the children was based wholly on them finding him both strange and unpredictable. The present myth about Groucho was that he was a labyrinthodite, a prehistoric blob composed of decomposing vegetable matter that had given birth to Siberia. The looming bulbous form, the dank, earthy colors, the primordial odor and bog-like noises that emanated from the depths of his brooding mass all took their cue from the shit-brown pipe that was permanently sunk into his damp, hairy face like a solitary rotting gatepost in some fog-clad swamp. God knows what he put in that pipe, but it had taken over what was once human. Curiously, this pipe was never lit. So what was the point in it? Some kids reckoned it was stuffed with tufts of beard. Others boasted it was nail clippings. Spud reckoned it was maggots because he'd seen a tub of them on the back seat of his dirty old banger, but Dylan topped him. Groucho slept in a bed of maggots and stuffed his ears with manky pubes to keep out the noise of his squelchy, guffy farts. Groucho, then, was part of the school, and never more a part of it than when haunting the corridors. When he was generally milling about, he wasn't that noticeable, a blurry blob, but if something attracted his attention, he would become still, motionless, like a statue. And when he did move, he moved with the dumb, killer grace of a shark, sniffing around before going in for the kill. "What are you doing here?" His muddy brown eyes looked as if no one was at home. Any sensible reply was pointless, for it was 50-50 whether he'd respond by intoning, "Move along, I haven't got all day," or "See me in my office at a time to be appointed at my behest." The worst thing you could say was nothing, sir. Groucho's vast mind was incapable of contemplating the notion of matter achieving a state of nothingness unless it resided outside the confines of the known universe, and he would lurch forward, moulding his palm around the heel of his pipe, his eyes flickering from side to side, and gasp, "It's an ill wind." And he'd stiffen up and bellow, "Out of my way, I haven't got all day." Once you knew about Groucho, he could be tolerated, and the thing to know about him were he didn't have an office. He was in school all day and had been since the beginning of time, and although clearly off his trolley, he was completely harmless. As a tangled briar of contradictions, the descriptive labyrinthodite suited him well, but Groucho stuck. He was snappy and had the ring of a football chant to it, but you wouldn't want to say it to his face. Look who it isn't, hollered Dylan as he spotted Gary coming out the toilets. It wouldn't be long now, thought Gary, seeing the explosive delirium in Dylan's face, before he spotted something else to mouth off about. Spunk. Wherever Dylan went, there was spunk. And he'd be yodeling and pointing, "Oh, spunk," as if it just fell out of your trousers. Like most things, teachers had a different word for it, sperm or the sperm. Granddad thought it meant pluck, idiot. He even had a saying for it, typical, "Ah, spunk." It was lunchtime, and Gary had lost count of Dylan's sightings. Some froth in the urinals aside, others had been plain stupid. A caravan for hire notice in the newsagent's window, a milkman with a limp, the symbol for a gravel pit on an ordnance survey map, a picture of a potato in a French book, pomme de spunk, a sherbet dab wedged in an inkwell, and a Kirby grip on the floor by Karen Westlake's locker. Once or twice there'd been nothing there at all, unless he meant his grubby finger. But the one that really pissed Gary off was the vapor trail of an aircraft several thousands of feet up in the sky. Gary had had enough. "What are you on about, Dylan?" "Look, spunk," he exploded, affronted by Gary's ignorance. "What, that?" pushed Gary, pointing at what looked exactly like dried up chewing gum, because that's what it was. "That's not spunk." "What is it then?" Dylan was too trigger happy for Gary, and before he could reply, Dylan was taunting, "Show us then, Fletch." "No, that's because you ain't got any, that's why, tosspot." If Dylan had been on the receiving end, he probably would have replied, "Got more than you have," but all Gary could muster was, "What do you know anyway?" To which Dylan would reply, "No more than you." And the predictability of this gave Gary a little boost of confidence, as did the equally predictable and timely arrival of Dylan's toad-licking best mate, Spud. Hardly best mates, they were more like bully and bully. Dylan was a reckless train wreck, and Spud, a nerdy science fiction freak, currently working his way through the entire science fiction collection in the school library in alphabetical order with the guidance of the fastidious Mr. Brown with an E. Dylan's interest in books began and ended with defacing them, crossing out the S in Oliver Twist being the latest craze. The only reason why Spud hung around with Dylan was so he wouldn't get bullied by others. Dylan bullied him something rotten, but at least Spud knew how, where, and when he was likely to be getting it. And one bully was better than many. "Look who it isn't," bawled Dylan. "It's Sputnik Spud and his spunk rocket." "Shut up," said Spud, scowling moodily. "Shut up," echoed Dylan, ripping the piss like he might rip crap wallpaper that was getting on his tits. "What do you know anyway?" "What?" said Spud with a frenzied frown. "I said, what do you know?" "What do you mean?" bounced back Spud, his face miserably knotted up. "What do you know?" shouted Dylan. "About what?" he shouted back, topping him and stretching himself up onto his toes. Dylan gnashed his teeth, took in a sharp breath, and blasted at him. "About anything." Spud stumbled on a reply that wasn't there, then said without thinking about anything except how to save face in front of Gary, "I don't know." To which Dylan emitted an unbroken sneer that groaned under the weight of its own tormented longevity. Finally, with a lingering contemptuous sneer, Dylan slurred, "He done nothing." Then he yanked Spud into a headlock and proceeded to slap him lazily about the head, punctuating each slap with the chant, He don't know fuck all 'cause he's thick as a shit. Well, said Gary before the pair of them ended up rolling around on the floor like they usually did. I know something no one knows. That did it. Oh, yeah? Said Dylan mid-slap. Oh, yeah? Came Spud's muffled reply as he peered out from under Dylan's arm before extricating himself and flattening his hair back down. I do, said Gary pointedly. What is it then? Said Dylan. Can you keep a secret? Like hell they could. Depends what it is, toyed Dylan. It's a secret, isn't it? Another aspect of Dylan's personality Gary couldn't be asked with, his blind dismissal of reason for the sake of leadership. Christ, Dylan, you idiot, mutinied Spud, who could get just as pissed off with Dylan at critical moments like this. Dylan placed his hand on Spud's shoulder to remind him he was in command. Hang about, Spock, he said. He turned to Gary. Fletch, spill the beans. Tell us what you know all. Promise? Yeah, just tell us. Gary quickly checked up and down the corridor, then drew them in. I know what Groucho's really got in his pipe. It was a blatant challenge, not something Gary was particularly at home with. He would normally be egging them on from the sidelines, but the incident on the bus that morning with Mr. Brown with an E had made him feel he could take Dylan on, beat him at his own game. No, you don't, chimed Dylan. Yes, I do. That's 'cause I told you. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. Don't think so. I did, erupted Dylan, jutting his jaw out. It's maggots, you Wally. That was me. I said that, elbowed Spud. Yeah, but it ain't that, said Gary before the fight broke out. Now it was 2 against 1, but Gary had the advantage of surprise. Oh, yeah? Yeah, replied Gary. What then? Demanded Dylan with increasing disdain. You should know, said Gary, just stared at him provocatively. There was deathly silence. Introducing a possible veiled insult like this could be dangerous with Dylan, as he was always quick to take offense. What are you saying, Fletch? He spat, and throwing his hand out to grab Gary's jumper, tilted off balance and trod heavily on Spud's foot. Ah, you bastard, yelped Spud. Groucho, spectre-like, slid into position at the far end of the corridor and came to rest unseen. Dylan, now highly excited by the realization that their being together like this was both dramatically clandestine and fraught with danger, beamed explosively at Gary and whispered urgently, Come on, what is it? Unfortunately, Gary's excitement produced in him an entirely different animal to Dylan's slavering hunter, and coupled with the fact that he was the keeper of the prey, he couldn't help but marvel at the ridiculousness of Dylan's squirrel-like frenzy. He jabbed his fists together and waggled his 4 fingers at Dylan, giggling. Look at his face, he's going to wet himself. He was verging on helplessness when Spud, bitten by the Dylan bug, grabbed Gary's wrists and as the bell rang manically to signal the end of lunchtime, bawled at him, Come on, you big git, fucking tell us. Gary couldn't have timed better. As in the split-second aftermath of the bell, he bellowed, It's Spunk! It was a lone cry in the wilderness of respectability. Unobserved, Groucho seized up and became fossil. Spud, crippled by a panic that they must have been heard, choked. Fucking hell, Gary, that was a bit fucking loud. But Gary didn't care, and he slumped against the lockers, heaving with laughter at his brilliant recklessness. With discovery still only a possibility, Dylan's insides didn't know which way to go or even which way they would go in the event of Dylan saw Groucho. Fucking hell, it's him. He jabbered at 1,000,000 miles an hour through clenched teeth, and all hell let loose. Who? What? Where? There? Shit. Fuck. Bollocks. Bollocks. I'm off. Pause for breath and a quick snapshot. Consequences. What have he heard? Gasped Dylan. Paralyzed, Gary and Dylan stood half crouched, clutching each other's arms and staring up the corridor. Pools of light spilled out along the length of the polished floor, and the air hung laden with anticipation. At the far end of the corridor, framed by frosted glass doors and silhouetted in profile, was the menace. Slowly, its head turned to face them, coming to rest like the single death knell. Still clutching each other, the boys edged themselves pathetically into a nearby stairwell where they hoped they would be hidden from its watchful gaze, their shared madness telling them that it couldn't have noticed their stealthy retreat since its face was in shadow. "What do you think?" said Dylan, awarding Gary the Légion d'honneur. "Spazza's legged it," said Gary, feeling flush. "Spazza, ha ha, good one, I like that. Fucking Spaz, we'll get him later." "Yeah, fuck him." "And fuck Groucho," said Dylan with a critical look at Gary. He wanted to test him. Spud always chickened out when the going got tough. Gary had never really joined in before. Bit of a do-gooder, perhaps he could replace Spud as his new ally. "So what do you say, Fletch?" "Huh? Groucho?" He'd caught that look from Dylan, and it made him feel uneasy, come to think of it. He didn't like it one bit. Shit, Dylan was up to something, and Gary, despite himself, was encouraging him. Dylan looked away for a second, smiling to himself, then turned back to congratulate him. "Fucking brilliant, that spunk in his pipe." Gary smiled back, more out of politeness than in anticipation of what was to follow. Being flattered by Dylan wasn't necessarily a good thing. "You know what that means, don't you?" said Dylan, eyeing him steadily. "What?" said Gary. It was better than saying no, or so he hoped. "He's a cunt. Cunt face." "Yeah," said Gary, nodding with false bravura. He didn't know what cunt meant. He'd heard it a few times before, and it was fairly obvious. It was a hard one, like fuck. It smoldered with aggression, a primal, gutsy vowel surrounded with punchy consonants. If you wanted to have a go at someone and you really fucking meant it, you call them a cunt. "You cunt." His nodding turned into a limbering up movement, and he began to wonder if this was what it felt like to be a teenager. "Yeah," he said, feeling confident now, rolling his shoulders like a boxer. "Full of spunk," snarled Dylan. "Full of it. Spunky cunt face. Yeah, he's a fucking cunt, that Groucho," said Gary, sparring and bobbing about. Dylan smiled at himself, to himself, shook his head, giving Gary a look that told him the hard man act didn't suit him, and Gary immediately wanted to stop everything, but Dylan was one step ahead. Whatever he had in mind for Gary, he was astute enough to tailor it to his entry level. "Listen," he said, putting Gary's fists down, "I've got an idea." "Oh," said Gary, cautiously easing his hands into his pockets. "Yeah." He motioned Gary for a quiet while he weighed up his options. Gary watched him intently. This was the Dylan you saw working the market store with his dad. He might be a nutcase, spouting off about spunk and defacing everything in sight with big hairy knobs, but he was also wily. Finally, Dylan pursed his lips and made a sucking sound with his teeth. He reached his decision. "All you've got to do," he said, leaning into Gary to whisper, "is go up to Groucho and call him cunt face. See what he does." Then he leaned back and bit his lip pensively, allowing time for Gary to take it in. "For what?" said Gary, both shocked and intrigued and wondering what the other options had been. "He won't do anything." "But he won't do anything. £1,000,000, nothing sweet FA. Dylan looked into Gary's uneasy face, cool as marble, knowing Gary would do this. All he had to do was sit back and wait. "Of course he will," said Gary, confused by Dylan's assertion. "No, I've done it myself." "When?" "The other day." "And?" "Nothing," with a nonchalant shrug. "It wasn't enough, though." Dylan had to clinch him quick. Look, he said reassuringly, he's harmless. Seriously, he won't do anything. He just stands there. You can say what you like to him. He's petrified, wouldn't know how to fly. Seriously. That was novel coming from Dylan. He must mean it. By now, Gary really ought to have been thinking what he let himself in for, but he wasn't. He was just sensing the pull of forces from over the threshold and was about to cross it, to jump off the cliff, to run from the cover. At a moment like this, you either do or you don't. All right, he said, piece of piss. And with a single stride, he turned out into the corridor, but it was no longer a corridor. It was the barrel of a gun, and he was the bullet. The ranks of lockers on either side of the passage brushed the skirts of his peripheral vision, a silent crowd willing him on, and his granddad's voice saying, pluck and courage, vim and verve, and above all this, hold your nerve. Now let's see some spunk. And there was Groucho, the labyrinthodite in the flesh. A cloud must have broken outside, for a shaft of sunlight plummeted down from a window on high and flooded the solitary form that was his quarry. Dust particles jostled upwards through the beam of light as if it were trying to flee, and the ever-still monument, in full profile now, stared achingly into the bristling canopy. Its ragged beard seemed to glisten with dew as Gary homed in. What are you doing, boy? The man's voice was disturbingly soft, a stark contrast to Gary's nervous excitement. Spunk chops. No, sorry, I mean, Groucho swiveled softly on his heels and lurched forward, molding his creased palm around the heel of his sun-polished pipe. Gary's heart was going like the clappers. He had to get it right, had to say it, with Groucho's hot face looming in his and his eyes flickering from side to side. Gary wondered if Groucho could see steam coming out of his ears, but then Groucho gasped, it's an ill wind, cut face. This was it. History. What it's like to be there, and nothing happens like it does in history. Groucho flicked his pipe out of his mouth. The stem was wet, and Gary knew exactly what Dylan would have said about that, and the thought made him shudder. Is that right now? Prodded Groucho, an utterance that was deftly followed by a barely perceptible glance over Gary's shoulder. Who's a lad, then? Gary couldn't admit to that. What a naff thing to say about yourself. I see your pals run off. Gary found Groucho's calm and measured manner exceptionally unnerving, and he just wished he wasn't there anymore. Sorry, he said. It was almost a whisper. He felt awful. Groucho eyed the boy. He'd obviously been set up. He had a natural empathy towards others who had been set up as he had. Did you mean it? I don't know. Yes, you do. Don't beat about the bush, lad. I suppose so. Then what are you apologizing for, eh? I didn't mean to do it. No, you meant to give me a birthday cake. He paused for a second. You didn't mean to, or you didn't want to? Groucho was eyeing him side on now. Gary didn't know what to think. Come on, lad. I didn't mean to, but I did. I wanted to. I think. Well, I'll tell you this. I want to knock your bloody block off, but I don't mean to. That is, I don't intend to. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Who's your tutor? Laurel, sir. Groucho just looked at him. Whether he was puzzled or disapproving, Gary couldn't tell, but he knew what he was supposed to say. Miss Ferguson, sir. Ah, Miss Ferguson. Ooh, on first name terms, are we? Shiver my timbers, one of those. Aren't you the lucky one? He paused for a second like he was gearing up for something, then said sarcastically, she'll be delighted. It was delivered with such forced glee that Gary knew straight away that he was going to be in deep trouble when she found out. Groucho truly meant to do business. He stood upright, placing his pipe back in its rightful place, and took out a notebook and pencil. He muttered Miss Ferguson's name as he scrawled it on the blank page. And your name? He squeezed out the corner of his mouth. A thought flashed through Gary's mind. Spud. Stephen Cook. But no. Gary Fletcher, sir. Groucho put his name in the book and continued to write, muttering just loud enough so Gary could hear. Gary Fletcher, who isn't old enough to grow a beard, but thinks he is old enough to draw comparisons between my beard and a woman's genitalia. It is a shame he had to use such an ungracious word to describe something which, no doubt, he will not have had the good fortune to have been, as it were, graced with. Although he stopped short, then said, without looking up, yeah, second year, sir. Groucho cocked an eye and carried on writing. I imagine it would be premature to introduce second years to the quaint delights of Canterbury and others such country matters. Then he stabbed the page with his pencil. Stop. He looked over the notebook at Gary and slapped it shut. Right, he said, rounding things off. You'll come and see me tomorrow after school for 1 hour's detention. I'll leave the details with Miss Ferguson. Now get to your class. I haven't got all day. Yes, sir. It was the first time Gary had wanted to laugh, and struggling to suppress it, he turned away and quickly started walking, but realizing he was going the wrong way, turned sharply back past Groucho. Something felt loose at his elbow. He grabbed his sleeve, and there was a gaping, ragged hole in his jumper. Dylan must have done it when he grabbed him. Indeed, he heard Groucho say, and turning around, saw that he was eyeballing the offending hole. I should, Coco. You might want to get a patch for that and tuck your shirt in. You look like a duck-billed platypus. Gary really wanted to laugh at that, so he legged up the stairs as fast as he could to his next class. I'll leave the details with Miss Ferguson. The words echoed round Gary's head all that day.